The 2018 film Burning, directed by Lee Chang-dong, presents audiences with a postmodern interpretation of the present-day serial killer. Making reference to both Mark Seltzer's Serial Killers and Richard Tilcott's Of Men and Monsters, I will illustrate the creation of the postmodern serial killer through the meta-narrative of the characters of Ben and Jong-soo. Richard Tilcott describes a serial killer as a part of American or American-influenced culture. With the United States having only 5% of the world's population, how is it that they've produced nearly 75% of the world's serial killers? Mark Seltzer argues that it is what he calls America's wound culture that causes these types of people to emerge. America's wound culture describes the public fascination with torn and open bodies, a nation that gathers around shock, trauma, and the wound. It is this fascination that caused the serial killer to emerge as the superstar of America's wound culture, shifting the focus away from the violent crimes to the personality type of the serial killer. And by the turn of the century, the serial killer had become a career option. Seltzer describes the serial killer as lacking interiority and is thus influenced by this wound culture. The serial killer defines themselves through the media, and their self-representation seems merely to reflect back cultural commonplaces. Working alongside this is the abnormal normalcy that the serial killer seems to display. Seltzer explains how the serial killer's absence of self and the mask of normalcy they create allows them to blend into society as a commonplace individual. The figure of Ben can be seen to exemplify these elements, and he's often depicted in ways that suggest his being a serial killer. American political scientist Christian Renwick Monroe presents a theory based on a universal morality and proposes the importance of identity in regards to one's moral actions and choices. In this first dinner scene, Monroe would argue that Ben's inability to feel emotions is linked to his lack of interior identity.
왜냐면 난 눈물을 흘리고 울어본 적이 없거든.
그래도 슬픈 감정을 느끼기는 하시잖아요.
그럴지도 모르지만 눈물이란 증거가 없으니 그게 슬픈 감정인지도 모르죠. 그건 비 같은 거.
Similarly, he aligns his morality with that of nature, describing it as simultaneous existence, displaying this compromised sense of morality as neither here nor there.
사람들이 떠내려간다. 거기에 옳고 그런 건 없어요. 자연의 도덕만 있지. 자연의 도덕이란 동시 존재 같은 거예요. 난 여기도 있고 저기도 있다. 그런 거.
Ben is also a figure seen to be highly Americanized, seen firstly through his name, Ben, compared to those film's counterparts of Hae-mi and Jong-soo. In their first meeting, Ben opts for a handshake opposed to the traditional bow that we see Jong-soo do.
벤이라고 합니다.
빨리 가서 한식 먹었으면 좋겠어.
As well, we begin to see his distaste for Korean foods. He makes a face at the idea of eating tripe stew and prefers rather Americanized foods like pasta.
내가 서울에서 최고로 잘. 종수 씨, 파스타 좋아하세요?
네?
Jong-soo also uses the American figure of the Great Gatsby in his description of Ben.
위대한 개츠비네. 뭐 하는지는 모르겠는데 돈은 많은 수수께끼에 젊은 사람들.
Lacking in interiority, Ben turns to this American serial killer as his model in creating his sense of self, creating the persona that we see throughout the film of a typical young, upper-class playboy male and not one of a serial killer.
나도 보고
The
싶어.
interactions he has with his mom and with his friends promote this mask of normalcy that he wears,
이번 주
and
한번
the fancy
들릴게요.
apartment and car furthers this class distinction.
예. 예, 엄마.
The serial killer is often seen as performing a critical function within our society by providing us with an example of what not to do. But Tilcott argues that the roles played for us by the serial killer and the roles we play for him are unstable and get confused, and not necessarily by accident. So while Ben displays the characteristics of the serial killer as a type of person, there's no tangible proof that he has ever actually killed anyone. The only proven killer in the film is Jong-soo. In part with the serial killer's lack of sense of self, Jong-soo is portrayed as completely yielding to non-personality. Throughout the film, he doesn't actually say much, avoids eye contact, and is often visibly uncomfortable within the social situations he finds himself. Part of what makes a serial killer is their ability to learn by watching. Serial killers make study of their own kind of person, and that's exactly what Jong-soo does with Ben, even if he doesn't know he's doing it. In Of Men and Monsters, Tilcott makes reference to the fear that as the influence of American culture spreads, so too will the disease of the serial killer. And as Ben has already been proven to be Americanized, it is he who passes his disease to Jong-soo. During their second to last meeting, Ben essentially urges Jong-soo to burn down a greenhouse, so to speak, which is exactly what he does the next time they meet.
여기서 베이스를 느껴야 돼요. 뼛속에서부터 그게 좀 울려줘야 그게 살아있는 거지.
Seltzer makes reference to the national distribution of serial murder cases and displays how the serial killer tends to run to the borders of their country in a physical expression of their mental extremity. Jong-soo is placed on the literal border between North and South Korea, another sign leading to the violent act to come. He also describes child abuse as having a foundational impact on the serial killer. Wounded as a child, wounding as an adult. As there is an obvious trauma in Jong-soo's childhood past, returning to his childhood home brings him back to that trauma and plays a role in this eventual turn to violence.
그게 폭탄처럼 터져요. 한번 터지면 모든 게 다 부서져요.
Let's look at the different typologies of the serial killer. There are 4 typical categories to which serial killers fall into: the visionary serial killers, mission-oriented serial killers, hedonistic serial killers, and power/control serial killers. I would place Ben as a mix between a visionary and mission-oriented killer. In adhering to this persona, he carries himself throughout the film with a kind of dominance and power akin to those of the upper class. Tilcott describes the serial killer as being imbued with mystery and power, which is not unlike how many members of the upper class society are seen. Ben later admits to being jealous of the relationship between Hae-mi and Jong-soo. As he is someone who does not experience emotions, it is not unlikely that he was intrigued by this and decided to play with Jong-soo. And there are many scenes throughout the film where Ben seemingly hints at his plans for Hae-mi to Jong-soo. During this kitchen scene, Ben describes making offerings and consuming them, suggesting his inflated feelings of his own importance, saying he's killing for some higher purpose. During this next scene, the greenhouse can be seen as a metaphor for his victims and suggests that he sees it as his duty to burn down the dirty lower-class people.
걔네들은 다 내가 태워주기를 기다리는 것 같아요.
For Jong-soo, I would also place him under the mission-oriented killer category. Seltzer describes the serial killer as the mass person, the complete fusion with the mass at the expense of the individual. Ideally, for this mass person, democracy is perfected through dead leveling, by which all individual distinctions vanish. He also describes a serial killer that is often driven by the collision of private fantasy into public reality. Aligning itself with the underlying class conflict that is evident throughout the film, Jong-soo's fantasies as a lower-class citizen are often clouded by elements from upper-class society. He masturbates not to Hae-mi, but to the Seoul Tower, twice. Part of his mission is to kill those upper-class citizens who take advantage of their power. Throughout the film, Ben's social status is on display and often in Jong-soo's face. So by killing Ben, he is leveling the playing field, as dead people are all on the same level. Mark Seltzer presents the postmodern serial killer not as an action, but as a specific type of person. Within this worldview, there are 2 types of serial killers. Those like Ben, who seemingly have already committed the crimes, and those like Jong-soo, who haven't yet. Just as you can still be an alcoholic and not drink, you can be a serial killer without having killed anyone. This film illustrates how postmodernity has created the personality type of the serial killer, maintaining that the violent nature is simply waiting for a time or a reason to show itself.